Okay, so it's now 6:05. So we will get started with the lesson really quickly. Okay, so now we are going into, or we are finishing up, I should say, the part of the textbook, right? Chapter 3, which talks about the executive branch. Okay, so Tuesday, we started this topic talking about the executive branch, and I will put that on our screen right now so we can share that. Yeah, so this is what we talked about briefly on Tuesday was the executive branch and how the president is the executive branch. We talked a little bit about the cabinet of the president and what they do, and the powers in the executive branch. Okay, so we're still right now focusing on the beginning chapters that are in our textbook, and also focusing on more of the structure and how our government functions before we get into the history of the United States, which we will get into in just a few weeks. Okay? So, the executive branch, the lesson that we had on Tuesday, I just mentioned from our objectives, you can see what we talked about. All right? So, we learned who is in charge of the executive branch, understood what the president, vice president, and the cabinet do. We practiced some vocabulary, and of course, we practiced the civics questions that go along with this particular chapter, um, so that you're prepared for the interview, right? And so we went over our vocabulary words, which were executive branch, the president, the vice president, the cabinet, rule of law, secretary, and then we went into exactly what the lesson was, right? The meat of the lesson, right? So, what is the executive branch we talked about? We tried to watch this video, the tour of the White House. I don't know if anybody looked this up later, right? But YouTube wasn't working that day. Seems to not want to work. But we saw a little bit, some photos of the White House, what it looks inside, right? The White House being the headquarters, right? The main place where the executive branch, uh, where the executive branch people work, the people that work in the executive branch, such as the president and the vice president and the cabinet, right, on the White House. So we saw pictures from the White House, which you can actually tour if you go to Washington, D.C. We talked about, right, the president, how to become the president, right, what kind of requirements there are, right? So must be 35 years old or older and is elected for every 4 years. We briefly mentioned the concept of commander in chief, right? Especially if you pay attention to the news, you might hear this term a lot, especially during election time, maybe. They refer to the president as the commander in chief, which just means that they are the leader of the military. And the president has the power to sign bills into law and also veto those bills as well, right? And remember from this lesson what veto means, or from uh, last lesson as well, when we talked about last Thursday, when we talked about how a bill becomes a law, right? And then the vice president and what he does or she does, the president's cabinet. All right, we had a very good question last class about the president's cabinet, talking about if they have any power, right? If they have any power over things that happen, and of course the question or the answer is yes, that they do have power, and it's over their own specific department, right? So does anyone remember from Tuesday what would we call the leader of the Department of State? What would we call somebody in the cabinet that is the leader of, for example, the Department of State? What would that person be called?
Go.
Maybe can't you unmute it yourself?
Oh, did
The
you flip
state
that?
secretary?
Yeah, close. So you would just flip it. So instead of a state secretary, it would be the Secretary of State, right? And do you also remember what his name is, our current Secretary of State?
Marco Rubio, I think.
Yeah, there you go. Marco Rubio is the current Secretary of State. Okay, and you would do that pretty much if you were asked who the leader is of the Department of Defense. They would be called, not their name, but their title would be the Secretary of Defense, right? And that would work for every department except for the Department of Justice, where they would be called the Attorney General, right? So we talked about the president's cabinet, and we saw a clip from the current cabinet, one of their meetings, right? And it kind of looked like this photo back here, where they're all gathered right around a table in the White House, and they're meeting, talking about different issues, whatever may come up, right? And they advise the president can give their opinions on what types of things they would like to see the president do or the country do, right? So we watched a little bit of that meeting. It was 2 hours long, but we didn't see the whole thing, just a few seconds, maybe a minute of it, right? Just kind of seeing what that looks like, right? And we talked about how they are chosen, right? It's a long process. So it's not just simply the president chooses and they become a cabinet member, right? They are nominated by the president, right? Difference between being chosen and nominated, right? They have to be approved. So they get approved by the Senate, right? And the purpose of that, involving the president and or involving the executive branch and the legislative branch, is to make sure one branch does not become too powerful. And once again, what is that term called? When one branch does not become too powerful?
Separation of power.
Yeah, separation of power, right? And so that's why some of these processes can be kind of complicated in our government, because we have that idea of separation of power to make sure that not one branch is too powerful, right? So that's how cabinet members are chosen. And then we went and tried to watch this YouTube video, but we only just saw some still images, right, from this. But still, you got an idea of what it looks like for a nomination hearing, right? So the president would nominate somebody for the cabinet, and the nominees would be questioned by the Senate, right? And we watched a little bit of the nomination hearing of Tulsi Gabbard, who was one of the current cabinet members under this current administration. So we watched a little bit of that, just seeing how that is set up. So they ask the questions, they answer the questions, and it can go on for hours, right? All right, and then we had some examples of the people that are currently in the cabinet. So starting from the left is the Secretary of State, right, which is Marco Rubio. In the middle, we have the Secretary of Defense, which is Pete Hegseth, and then on the right is the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is Kristi Noem, right? So we have kind of putting faces to these positions. So just if you see them on the news or anything, you kind of recognize what they do and what their function is, what their job is in the government. Right? And then the rule of law is an important term to remember, that no one is above the law, and even the president and cabinet members and anybody in the country must follow the law, because that is one of the questions that you might be asked on your interview, just simply to define the rule of law. Right. So then we went into our questions, and we'll do them again, just like at the beginning of any class. We go through and practice our questions that we did last class again, right? Just make sure everyone's updated. So who is in charge of the executive branch?
The president.
Perfect. Yeah, the president. So the president is in charge of the executive branch. Okay, and so what does the president's cabinet do?
They advise the president.
Yes, so they advise the president, right? And right, that would be the most simple answer to give in your interview. Just 3 words, very short and simple. No need to go too complicated. but just they advise the president, or you could say give advice to the president, or even you could say help the president, and that would be an acceptable answer as well. All right. So that's what the president's cabinet does, and just 3 short words to get that question right on your in your interview. Okay. So what is the rule of law?
Everyone must follow the law.
Yeah. So everyone must follow the law. Simple. So rule of law. What is the rule of law? What does that term mean? Everyone must follow the law, right? The law rules everything, right? So everyone must follow it. All right. And so those were the only 3 relevant questions that had to do with that specific part of, or that specific lesson, I'll say. And so now we are continuing with the executive branch. All right. And we'll talk a little bit more today about the election of the president, how that works. And we'll go a little bit more into depth about the line of succession, which we'll learn as one of our vocabulary words. Okay, so the executive branch of elections and powers, right? That's what we'll be focusing on in this class. So we will have our objectives, right, to understand how the president is elected. We'll also briefly talk about political parties, right, and that is very much relevant to understanding how the president is elected. And then also learn about who leads the military, which is a term, right, Commander-in-Chief, we recognize from Tuesday. Okay, so these will be our objectives for today. All right, so a few vocabulary words you'll need to know before getting into this specific area is election. Okay, that's one of the most important. So the definition would be the process of voting for leaders, and kind of used in or as an example is that we vote for president in November. So that would be an example of an election. All right, so the election in November, that's specifically talking about when we vote for president in November, right? If it's the election to elect a president, it would be called a presidential election, right? The election to vote for a senator would be a senatorial election. For governor, gubernatorial election, right? But it's important to know this word election, right? The process of voting for leaders, okay? Then we have commander-in-chief. Once again, we talked about this on Tuesday. And so all this term means, and you may hear the president be referred to as the commander-in-chief. This just means the leader of the United States military, all right? And so the president is the commander-in-chief, all right? And this guy in the middle we'll talk about a little bit more today. The guy in the middle is U.S. president, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, and then political party, also very important. So a group with ideas about government, right? And in the United States, we have 2 main or major political parties, okay? And these 2 are the Democrats and the Republicans. So the Democratic and Republican parties are the main political parties in the United States, okay? Does anyone know so this image right here at the bottom, which image represents the Democrats and which image represents the Republicans?
I think the elephant represents the Republicans, and I don't know if it's a donkey or a horse represents the Democrats.
Yeah, that's correct. So, yeah, the elephant represents the Republican Party. That's their logo. And, yeah, it's a donkey is on the right, and that represents the Democratic Party. Okay, so if you see either one of these or if they look familiar, that's what they represent, right? They represent the political parties, or the 2 main or major political parties in the United States. All right. And then we have the Democratic Party, right, which is represented by the donkey. And so definition, a Democrat is a member of the Democratic Party. And so the donkey is their symbol, all right, of the Democratic Party. Okay, so usually if there are 2 candidates running against each other, 2 people that want to be president, right? You will have one candidate that has this logo next to their name, or maybe just a D, right? And then the other candidate would have an elephant or an R next to their name that would represent their political party. So a Republican is a member of the Republican Party, okay? And for them, the elephant is their symbol, their logo of the party. Okay, so if you ever see the news and you're wondering why there's just an elephant or a donkey on the screen, these little cartoons of a donkey or an elephant, they just represent the two major political parties in the United States. Okay, and then another vocabulary word, which is succession. Okay, so this refers to, and we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday, the order of who becomes president. Okay, so we have this long list of people, right? The line of succession, of presidential succession, okay, that shows what would happen if the president cannot serve any longer, okay, for whatever reason. All right, and so you can kind of see here, obviously the president would be at the top, and you have the entire line of people that if the president cannot serve, you have the vice president, and then later Speaker of the House, so on and so on, right? Okay, so far, are there any things anyone needs clarified about the vocabulary words or anything from last class that you need to get clarified? Any questions so far? All right, sounds good. Okay, so this is something that can be very confusing, right? But and you don't necessarily need to know to become a citizen for the purposes of just passing the test. But it's very important to understand, especially as you become citizens and vote in presidential elections, to know how it works. All right. So the basics of a presidential election, which I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with, are that we vote in November every 4 years. Okay, so every 4 years we vote in November to elect a new president. Okay, so the last presidential election was November of last year, so 2024. The next presidential election will be in November of 2028. The next one, November 2032, and so on and so forth, right? But we have a very kind of complex process of how we elect a president, how we determine who will be the next president when everyone votes, right? So this number up here on the top right, the one that says total, okay? Now, I'm not very good at math, but it'll be simple math. And let me ask this first. How many total number of representatives do we have in the United States, in the House of Representatives? Does anyone remember that number?
I think it was 300 and something, but I forgot exactly what number.
435.
Perfect. There you go. 435.
There you go.
Yeah. So you were kind of close. 435, right? And then how many senators do we have in the United States, in the entire country?
100.
100. And so 435. See, I told you I was bad with math, numbers. So 435 plus 100 equals 538, right? So it equals this number up here. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Okay. So the way we elect a president is not like how we would elect a senator in our state or how we would elect the governor of our state, where all you have to do is get the majority of the votes and you win. Okay? Instead, what we would do is each state is given basically points. It's given a number. Okay? And that number is the number of representatives that state has versus added with the number of senators that state has. Okay, so when we talked about the House of Representatives, which I believe was 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, right? We showed the difference between Wyoming and California, right? The difference between those two states. Does anyone remember how many representatives Wyoming had?
2.
Not representatives. They had 2 senators. How many representatives did they have?
I think it was just one.
1.
Yeah, just one.
Yes.
Because Wyoming has the least amount of people than any other state, right? So Wyoming has 1 representative, but 2 senators. And if you look on the map right here, they have 3 kind of points, or what we would call electoral votes. Okay, so it's the number of representatives added with the number of senators in that state. Okay, and so if you watch TV on election day this past November, you would have seen all the people on TV kind of focus in on each individual states. Okay, and so when a candidate, let's say, is running for president, right? Instead of adding the total of the entire country and whoever gets the most votes out of everybody in the entire country, it goes by the individual state. So let's say there's a Democrat and a Republican facing off against each other, running against each other, right? And in Texas, the Republican has more votes than the Democrat. Then the Republican, how many electoral votes or points would the Republican get if they have the majority in the state of Texas? Based on the map.
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah. It's a little confusing. So if a Democrat and Republican are running against each other for president, right? And let's say, for example, in Texas, in the specific election, right? So when we do for president, we focus in on the specific state, okay? And the Republican has more votes than the Democrat in Texas, right? They win in Texas. How many points does the Republican win? How many do they get?
40?
Yeah, 40. Yes, so this is where it's confusing, right? Where we usually think of elections as being, whoever gets one more vote than the other person, at least, just the simple majority. Instead, in the United States, we count based on the specific states, okay? So if the Republican gets even just one more vote than the Democrats in Texas, they win 40 points. The entire state's points or electoral votes in Texas, right? Same thing like in California, usually if it goes for a Democrat, so for the Democratic candidate, they would win 54 electoral votes or kind of points if they even just get one more vote than the Republican, right? So that's kind of how we do it. And whoever gets the majority out of all of these, out of all the states, right, which would be 270 electoral votes, becomes president, okay? And that's basically kind of the basic way of explaining how we elected president. And so this entire process, or this entire kind of point system, is called the Electoral College, okay? Now there's a lot more that goes into it. I would suggest if you want to research this a little bit more, it's could be a very interesting thing to research, go into more depth about this, see how they actually cast their votes, right? There are actual people that are called electors, right? So, but you can all research that on your own if you're interested, because then it gets into more complicated matters, right? But the basic things to understand about how we elect a president and the things that you'll see on TV, on the news, if you watch the news on election day, will be that each candidate just wants to get to 270 electoral votes. They want to win as many states as they can to get to that majority and win the 270, what we call electoral votes. Okay? It's a little bit confusing, but that's how we elect a president in the United States rather than simply do whoever gets the majority of the people's votes, right? So any questions about the electoral college or that process?
Yeah, I have a question. So, when the country is voting for the president, so they are not actually voting directly for the president candidate. They are voting for the representatives and the senators, right?
Well, okay. So you would vote for the senators and the representatives separately. Okay, so let's say you go to your, and this might be a long answer, but let's say you go to vote, right? And remember, we said so representatives are every 2 years, senators every 6 years. So they won't be on the ballot during every presidential election. Well, for senators they won't. For representatives they will, right? But when you get your ballot, you'll have a section that says for the president, a section that says for your representative. You might have a section that says for senator, and you'll vote on multiple different things that aren't just for president, right? So you will vote for your representatives and senators, and you will have a section where you vote for the president, where you vote for the candidate that you want to become president, okay? But you vote, basically, you vote for them to win your state, okay? So when you vote in Utah, right, your vote is counted to the overall amount of people in Utah that voted for this candidate and that candidate, right? And so in 2024, in the past election, right, everyone went out and voted, right? And in Utah, for example, more people voted for Donald Trump than the Republican nominee candidate, then voted for Kamala Harris, the Democratic candidate. So therefore, Donald Trump got 6 kind of points or electoral votes, right? So when you vote for president, really you kind of are voting for that candidate to win your state, right? So you will vote for them. You will put a candidate on your ballot for president, right? But it will mainly not count towards a national total. It will be towards a state total for them to win the points in your state. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I think it makes more sense, but it's so confusing for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's too confused.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and so that's why I encourage you. We could have an entire lesson just on this. All right. And I like mentioning it because it's relevant, especially as all of you will become citizens and will participate in presidential elections. But I don't want to put us too far back in the class, right? But it would be, yeah, I think it would be a good topic to research further on your own. There's lots of resources, lots of videos to understand this more. And yeah, I just touched on the surface level. There's a lot more that goes into this. But yeah, so it can be very confusing, right? And kind of a little bit weird, especially when you think that when you vote for president and you put that person on your ballot, you fill their name in, that you're directly voting for them on a national level, but instead it's more of on a state level for them to win your state's electoral votes, right? And so I have another map that I can show. Let's see. So if we go to over here, there's this website that allows you to kind of fill it on your own, and you can kind of do a. Oh, let me see. It's not letting me share. Let's see. If I go back. Okay, let's try to share the screen now. Okay, there we go. So let me see. I can set this as a blank map. For example, and you might see this on TV, especially during election season. The year of the election, so in 2028, probably we'll see this all over the news. Sometimes even now, they like to try to predict this, but you can just go in and kind of see how things would change. So you have the Democrats on the left, the Republicans on the right. Right, Democrats are blue, Republicans are red, and you kind of show how things would play out. So if you just click these in, fill these in, right? If they're red, right, you got 4 electoral votes, 3, 6, 10, 5, adds up to 28. You flip them, you go blue for the Democrats, then now it's 28 for Democrats. And then if you keep going, right, whatever, eventually the goal is to get to 270 votes, and then that's when they would win. And an interesting thing to look is that there's an option for there to be a tie, 269, and I would recommend researching further to understand this process a little bit more. All right, but there's a whole other process that goes into this, a lot more. All right. So, any more questions about this electoral college, the way we elect a president? All right. So yeah, you may see this a lot, or have seen this, a map that looks just like this back in November. So this probably, hopefully, is familiar to you, and if it's brand new, then yeah, keep researching. It gets this is just the surface level, right? Okay, so that's kind of how we elect a president. Okay, and then we have term limits. Okay, so before there was not an amendment. When I say before, I mean in the early 1900s and before then, right, since the beginning of the country, there wasn't a term limit on the president, right? So the president could technically run for as many terms as they wanted. Okay, but this guy kind of changed that. So does anyone recognize him? Know what his name is?
No, but I'm guessing he's a president, former president.
He's a former president, and so we'll talk more about him in the coming weeks when we get to our history portion of this class. And so he's Franklin Roosevelt, who was one of the presidents, and he was a president during a very important time in American history, right? And he became a very popular president. So he was president. He was elected for 4 different terms, okay? And so that's like 16 years he was in office for, right? And so after he served for his 4 terms, Congress decided to create a constitutional amendment, right, which was the 22nd Amendment at that time, which changed the Constitution, and it said that the president can only serve for 2 terms. Okay? Just once again to demonstrate the Electoral College, right, how we vote for president, and if we go to see all of the elections that he won, let's see, I'm sharing, try this again. Okay, there we go. So you can see this was back in the 30s. The 1932 election was when he was first elected. And if you scroll down, so you can see he was a Democrat. He ran against Herbert Hoover, who was the Republican in that election. And it shows the electoral map as well. And you can see the blue is Roosevelt for Democrats, the red is the red is for Republicans. And he won the vast majority of states in 1932, in 1936 against Alf Landon. He won every state except for 2. In 1940, he won basically the majority of the states again, right? And then in 1944, he won pretty much the majority again, right? So he was very popular president, and we'll talk more about that later. Hopefully that gives you more of an idea of how the Electoral College works, right? And you can see his electoral count at the top right there. You can see he had 432 electoral votes to the 99 that Thomas Dewey got in the 1944 election. Right. So because of him serving those 4 terms, Congress created the 22nd Amendment, which made sure that presidents could only serve for 2 terms, okay, for 8 years, and that's it. All right. And then we have our political parties. So pretty much, as we've been talking about the electoral college and the way that we elect our president, we also have more than just 2, or we've mainly talked about the 2 political parties, right, the Republicans and the Democrats. But there are more political parties out there. There are more options out there, right? And so we have these up here, the image on the top. We have the elephant that represents the Republican Party and the donkey that represents the Democratic Party. But we have these down here that are called third parties. Okay, they're usually referred to as third parties, right? The candidates are referred to as third party candidates. And that's usually, they're referred to as third parties because they present a third option to the 2 major political parties. So the third option to the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay, and so you can kind of see their logos down here, and they don't always have to have an animal, right? But some examples are the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and the Constitution Party. Right? These parties are usually centered on one issue that they want to highlight. But yeah, they do have candidates that run in major elections that you can vote for and become a member of if that's what you'd like to do. But there are more options than just the Democrats and the Republicans, but they usually do not win as many elections or any elections compared to the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay, so once again, we have the succession. And when we looked at the vocab term, there was a chart that had all the titles, right? But there are 3 main, I would say 2 main points of succession that are important to know, right? So you have the vice president who would step in, who would become president if it is needed, if the president cannot serve, right? Or if the president resigns or is not fit to serve. And then if the same happens to the vice president, then it would go to the Speaker of the House. Okay, so does anyone recognize or can anyone tell me who their names are from last class and from last week? So we'll start with this guy on the left, who is the vice president. What is his name?
J.D. Vance.
Yeah, so J.D. Vance is the current vice president of the United States. And then on the right, the Speaker of the House. And what is his name? If you remember from 2 weeks ago.
Mike Johnson?
Yeah, there you go. So Mike Johnson. So these are the main points of the presidential succession. So it would go to president, and then President Donald Trump, and then to the vice president, J.D. Vance, and then third in line for the president is the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Okay? And once again, I will say this every time we mention their names, especially for Mike Johnson, because this could change. It changed a lot last year. Make sure before you go to your interview that you make sure that the names of the people that you need to know are still up to date. Okay? Things can always change. So this is current as of today, who's the vice president, Speaker of the House. But just to be safe, before you go to your interview, make sure you just do a quick Google search and make sure that they are still the people that are in these offices, that are in these positions. Okay, so you don't get these wrong on your interview just because you didn't look. Okay, just make sure to make a mental note to check that when you go for your interview, whenever that may be. All right. Okay, so that concludes the executive branch so far. All right. So, any questions so far? This might have been a confusing lesson, right, with the electoral college and political parties. But any questions so far about maybe anything that has to do with the executive branch?
I think it may be interesting that the issue of succession, the president can only serve 2 terms now because of the constitutional amendment. But there's been some talk about whether there may be an interest in trying to get around that some way.
Yeah.
So that he could serve longer.
Yeah. So that's been also something interesting as well. That's been talked about recently. Yeah. So, and I've mentioned in some of the former classes, and this stuff is obviously some of the stuff, as you may notice, as we go into the civics questions for the executive branch. You may not even have to know these things for your interview, right? But it's very important to know to be a citizen, and especially when you look in the news, that you're understanding what the headlines actually mean, because you learned what the term limits and how the term limits came about. You know what the electoral college is. You know about the political parties and the third party. So it's kind of good information to know, so that once you become citizens, you have that knowledge to interpret the news headlines and understand them for yourselves, right? With this background knowledge, right? So, but yeah, that's an interesting point. All right. So, any other questions or before we go into the civics questions? All right. So we'll go right into it. So, the first one: in what month do we vote for president?
November.
Yep, November. All right. Vote for the president in November. So who is the commander-in-chief of the military?
The president.
Yep, the president. Perfect. What are the 2 political parties in the U.S.?
Republicans and Democrats.
No, Republicans and Democrats. Yeah, notice how their wording is, what are the 2 political parties, right? Well, those are the 2 major political parties. And there are some other, what are referred to as third parties, that provide a third option as well, right? And so who becomes president if the president can't serve?
Vice President.
Yeah, the vice president. And I'll add this in there, what is his name? The current vice president of the United States.
J.D. Vance.
Yeah, J.D. Vance. And actually, let me write that out, because that can, so you know how it looks in spelling. So it would look like this. So J.D. Vance. All right. So that's how it looks in spelling. All right. So the vice president and currently would be J.D. Vance. All right. And then those are the only questions. So pretty simple, right? Let's keep on going, and I'll see you guys next Tuesday with our next topic, which actually, let me see what that is. Next week, if you want to get ahead of the curve and looking in your textbook, we will talk about the next branch of government, which will be the judicial branch. All right. And then we'll finish out the boring, branches of government part. And then we'll kind of get into some rights and responsibilities, geography, and then finish out with some American history. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
I will see everybody on next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.